Hello and welcome to the Help My Wealth podcast, Money Rules or Money Rules. Here at Help My Wealth, we are all about empowering financial success in our community of listeners. We hope you find today's topic both informative and helpful. Hi, and welcome back to the Help My Wealth podcast, Money Rules or Money Rules. I'm your host, Stephen Logan, and with me as always is Hamish Ferguson, and today we have our special guest, Toni Knight. Toni, thank you for coming.
Welcome.
Absolute pleasure.
Toni is a psychotherapist and a presenter specialising in anxiety, burnout and trauma. Toni helps people to get past their past, improve their ability to relate to others, and make helpful decisions to increase their energy and professionalism. Toni believes that mental training is the foundation for using our minds to create rich and a meaningful life. So thank you so much for coming, Toni.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Look, Help My Wealth was delighted when Toni came on board to create our behavioural psychology modules. And I must say that they've actually become a bit of a foundational training for our Help My Wealth community. And for me personally, I actually really enjoy them. I learn a lot through those modules. So thank you so much for coming on board and doing that.
Yeah, it was a great experience. I really enjoyed doing it.
Yeah. How about you, Hamish?
Yeah, look, I've always wondered whether our mental state and how we think about things has more influence over how we manage our money than what we give it credit for.
Oh, 100%.
And I guess seeing these modules and just really unpacking them has really helped to cement that and almost make that theory come to reality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and at Help My Wealth, both with the podcast and with our training, we're all about empowering people's financial journey. But part of that, it's not just about money, is it? It's about that holistic life experience. So having you come on board and give that experience and that professionalism and education was just fantastic. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's great. Yeah, I loved being part of it.
Yeah. So look, I always ask all of our guests here on the show, if you could go back and tell your 18-year-old self one piece of advice from everything that you've learned, what would it be?
Wow. There's a lot I'd like to tell my 18-year-old self, I have to say.
Just one?
I'd like to sit it down, have a nice long coffee, few hours, Look, I think of all the things I'd like to tell her, perhaps the most important one would be to not let fear get in the way too much of big decisions. There's a place for fear and, negative feelings are not bad. They feel bad, but they're not bad. Negative feelings can be really, really helpful up to a point.
Yeah.
A little bit of fear is good. It keeps us kind of, checking that, I guess, we've got the right information, that we're making the right moves. It keeps us cautious. But I think that when we let fear get out of hand, it can stop us altogether from doing things that are really important in life. And I think my 18-year-old self was probably a little too afraid of the world and thinking that, she couldn't deal with it. And so I would love to have been a lot bolder and made some bigger decisions. That's what I would tell her, that, fear is something that is good, but it can be managed and it doesn't need to hold you back.
Do you think that that's almost something that you have to learn over time? Do you think that's something that you can actually tell an 18-year-old now and that they would actually grasp and get? Or do you feel that even if you went back and actually spoke to that, young 18-year-old Toni Knight, that she would get it? Or do you feel that in some ways experience almost has to be the teacher?
I think you make an important point there, Steve. I think it's great to have someone there to tell you that at one time, but really traveling alongside someone, perhaps as a guide, a mentor, is going to be a lot more effective because, it's one thing to say, look, don't let fear hold you back. And maybe 18-year-old Toni would have looked into that and gone, well, what does that mean for me? How do I make that a reality for myself? But being 18, I doubt I would have done that. And so it is a journey because when you think about what fear is, it's telling you that you're not safe.
Yeah.
It's telling you that there is a threat. Okay. And so it's one thing to go, those things that you're afraid of, they seem like they're threats, but in fact they're not. I think that having the knowledge is one thing. Knowing is a great start. But if we don't feel that we're safe, if we don't feel that, we can get on top of this and move forward on, some important life decisions, then that knowledge is going to largely go to waste, and my clients all the time see me for the same kind of problem. It's like, I know that I should be okay. I should feel safe. I should feel good about my life, but I don't. And so, if it was just as simple as saying, well, look at all the good things going on in your life, snap out of it, I wouldn't have a job. We could do that for each other. You wouldn't need psychotherapists. It's not that simple. It is an experience. It's a bit of a journey. I'd like to think with the right kind of tools, the right kind of support, for most people it won't be a long journey, but nevertheless, you're right about that.
And do you think there was opportunities that you missed because of that fear?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I am a very late bloomer. Look, I think I'm getting there now, but it has taken a long time for me, to feel safe enough to take some risk. For example, becoming self-employed and starting a business and marketing myself and getting clients. Even 10 years ago, that would have been, on my radar, but something that I felt that I wasn't capable of doing. So, definitely.
It's interesting. Just that statement about fear, all right, and thinking about today's society even, and the fear that's out there around the climate or, around are we going to blow ourselves all up in 50 years or tomorrow or whatever, like
COVID, the Ukraine war,
absolutely.
whatever.
There's plenty of things to get afraid of.
So it's interesting how just over the generations, that same thought process as an 18-year-old, all right, is relevant today. Things haven't really, changed in that sense. Does that make sense? Or
I think that there's, there were things to be afraid of back then when I was younger, and there still is today. And, I'm not necessarily saying that we need to just ignore all of that, but the truth is that when it comes to things on a larger scale, there's very little that we can do as a human, as an individual human. And that's not to throw our hands up in the air and say, look, it's all beyond us. We do what we can do, but we also recognise that it's better to focus our energy on the things that we have some control over. And that's going to be a much, much smaller circle than thinking about the wider world and, geopolitical problems and climate change and, those kinds of really big issues. In fact, I have many clients that because they are so focused on those things and feel so unable to do anything about it, they effectively become quite paralysed with their fear. And when you think about it, that doesn't serve anyone, particularly the individual themselves. And so I often say to people, look, bring your circle in and focus on what you can control. And there's not much in our world that we can control, actually. On most good days, we can control our behaviour. And that's about it.
Yeah, and I think also for our society, like media, be it traditional media, be it social media, has recognised that fear is a great way to motivate response. And so, when you look on those things, it's quite fear-driven, isn't it? A lot of articles, a lot of stories, a lot of issues are all centred around that as well. So I think it is hard in a way for people to actually pull themselves out of that, particularly if you're, going down that direction already.
Absolutely. Look, I think all forms of media promote fear because humans are designed to pay a lot of attention to things that are threats. It's part of our survival mechanism. So when you think about it, mainstream media, the news headlines are always quite macabre. There's that old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Social media is the same. Even advertising is really preying on our fear of being inadequate, in the eyes of key people, society in general, and then saying, here, we have the answer for you. So, it's all around us. And I dare say it's almost countercultural. It's almost an act of rebellion to be able to bring our focus in to the things that we can control and go, I get that that's out there. I'm not burying my head in the sand. But I'm going to bring my focus into what I can do about those things and anything else that matters a lot to me. And I think that's very powerful.
So, Toni, if we reflect back on that 18-year-old self, many people equate their current happiness in relation to how they're going financially, how they're going with their goals, how they're going with success. What would you say to her in regards to that?
So achieving goals can certainly make you happy, but I think there's a couple of important considerations there. Number one, we know that achieving goals is a good thing, but that the happiness that comes from achieving goals in itself is not going to last. Why? Well, because no internal state lasts. When you think about our thoughts and our feelings, they're moving through us. They are temporary experiences that happen to us. They change all the time. And so achieving a goal is certainly a cause for celebration and being happy, but it's no substitute for a fulfilling life. And so, when people say, well, look, I just want to be happy, it's a valid thing. Of course we want to be happy. But really, when you drill down into what that really means, and researchers have done this, of course, what people really want is a life that is fulfilling, satisfying. They want contentment. And so this is a much bigger concept than just mere happiness, which, as I said, is a temporary state that comes and goes. We enjoy it while it's there. It's not going to last. And so we don't want to build a life around that. And so I would say to my 18-year-old self, by all means, set yourself some goals and enjoy it when you achieve them. But it's like Grandma used to say, it's all about the journey. It's the person that we become on the way to achieving our goals that really makes the difference, that creates that sense of purpose, fulfillment, that brings us together as a group, that enables us to learn and grow as people, that allows us to give to something bigger than ourselves. It's all those things that make life really, really rich and meaningful. That's a good life, not mere happiness, which is temporary.
And so if we talk about that, that self that has now grown, you've had
considerably older.
Considerably old.
Yeah.
You've had a very colourful and varied life, and you've had different roles and responsibilities and all the rest of it. But, especially now as a psychotherapist, I'd have to ask the question, what do you think is most understood about you? What do people see and assume with you that is probably the most misunderstood thing?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think that it would be probably that psychotherapists somehow have all the answers, that we don't go through all the other feelings.
You never get sad, you never get depressed, you never get fearful, you never get angry.
Right, that's right. I do think that having been a psychotherapist has been such an incredible blessing to my life. I love reading about psychology, and I love really thinking about how to apply that to the real world, which was, I guess, what I did when I collaborated with you guys on the project. But, even despite all the richness of those learnings and how to apply it to my own life, we humans, we don't operate well on our own. And so what that means is that I can know a lot of stuff, but it doesn't mean that I necessarily implement it well all the time. I still need other people to pull me up, to keep me in line, to tell me to pull my head in, and so it's allowed me to have incredible humility for my clients and for people who are struggling. People often think that they are broken, that there's something wrong with them, that they're failures when they don't seem to be doing well in life, particularly if they have to come and see a psychotherapist, which many Australians will avoid at all costs because of that sense of failure that they feel. But I say to people, that's just good strategy. Having an advisor, a helper, is good strategy, which is, why people come to see the two of you as well. They could make financial decisions or, house purchase decisions on their own. But why would you do that if you can have someone that has more expertise, more experience, that knows more about that particular topic Why wouldn't you, link with them? And it's the same with basic psychotherapy, and so even though I am a psychotherapist, I would be much more willing now to see a psychotherapist or someone, because I know that I don't have it all together, that I still need, as a human being, that extra brain that allows me to function so much better.
Yeah, yeah. And look, there was a period of your life where you spent, quite a bit of time with what most people in society would consider the very rich, the famous, the successful people. I mean, for you, how has that affected you in regards to, your goals and your dreams and your aspirations heading out from there?
Yeah, that's right. And it has. You're right, Steve. Those experiences have been quite formative. So just to expand slightly, my husband and I had an opportunity to live, twice actually in the past, on resort islands. One of them, the more recent one, was in 2003 in the Caribbean, a small deserted island that basically was like a playground for the rich.
Yeah.
It's only about 2 hours, I think, direct flight from New York.
Yep.
And it's nice and warm. And so we saw a lot of the rich and famous come in. We saw extreme wealth.
Yes.
And all that entails.
Yeah. And, from what I know, they actually spent, it wasn't just a weekend holiday. They were actually living there a lot of the time. And so you actually were there with them and seeing them in their daily lives, so to speak. It wasn't just a week away. It was actually, they're here for 6 months, or they're here for a year, or they're here for, that period of time.
For some of them, that was true. Some of them had actually bought villas on the island, and so spent some of their year in those villas. Yeah, absolutely.
So, look, I think that for a lot of people, we all have to different degrees aspirations to become fabulously rich or fabulously wealthy or fabulously famous or some degree of that. Do you know what I mean? So for you, actually experiencing that lifestyle, how did that change your view of wanting to make those your goals to achieve and attain?
Yeah, I describe it as sort of living like a millionaire, a multi-millionaire, without having been one.
Yes.
Because I was living in this beautiful, paradise kind of island in a nice villa.
With all the trappings that go with that.
Absolutely. And I've done that twice. And so I feel like I know what it's like without having been extremely wealthy myself. I mean, obviously I'm privileged compared to a lot of people in the world, but certainly, quite humble compared to some of the people that, I came in contact with.
1%.
And the impact that had was helping me to know for certain, not just to intellectually know, but to know for certain, to feel that extreme wealth was no ticket to a fulfilling life. Now, I'm not anti-money, not at all. I think money has its place. And, one of the great things about money, as far as I can see, is that it gives you options. It gives you a lot of options. It gives you freedom to choose. And I think that's a great thing about it. But arguably, and I think the research backs this up, after you get to a certain level of wealth, additional money doesn't add a lot to the quality of your life. And so, it's one of those things that is nice to have and certainly important to have if you don't have enough. And so I would think that if people don't have enough money, it should become a fairly important goal. To buy them enough choice to be able to live in their society according to their values. But it's our values that make all the difference. The money allows us more options to honour our values, to live what I call a values-centred life. And, in my work, in all my work, that's the aim of what I do, is to help people to identify their values. And by values, I just simply mean what's most important to you, what really matters. I mean,
let's face it, it's not the money that you're after, it's what it can give you, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, I've often been, confronted by stories of people where they'll talk about, genuinely happy societies or content societies being sometimes the ones that have got the least, right? And they actually don't have the options Like it's like, well, this is our life. We're happy. We're content. And sometimes options in themselves can almost confuse us, can't they?
It is possible to have too many options. That's absolutely true, Hamish. I think that, in those societies, people's expectations are quite different. And so, they're connected in with their values. And, for many of those societies, I think it's all about connection, connection to family, connection to community. I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, so I can't really speak, much in that area. But these are the things that, by and large, we know as human beings do make a difference to our happiness. And so, as I said, in a Western culture, money can be quite helpful.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They're definitely not saying, we shouldn't have money, all right?
Or plan for it, or, work out how you're going to grow it.
Absolutely. It's a perspective, isn't it?
Yes.
It's really just saying, well, I've got to be careful not to let this thing rule my life and the consequences of it.
Absolutely.
Right? So,
there's a really fabulous American researcher called Tim Kasser who wrote a lot about this. He has a wonderful book called The High Price of Materialism. He doesn't moralize at all about money. What he does is research, I guess, the impact of pursuing material goals. And when he says material goals, he's talking about money, fame, appearance, those kinds of things. And, surprise, surprise, people that tend to prioritise those things are less happy than other people. And it's simply because prioritising those things will often take our attention, time and energy away from the things that we know actually really do make quite a positive difference to our well-being, to our contentment. And it should come as no surprise that those things are things like connectedness to other people. Humans are a hyper-social species. We need to be around each other. And in fact, loneliness is such a big issue in Western societies that quite a few governments of Western countries have appointed a minister for loneliness.
Really?
It is such a big issue. Yeah, some recent research showing that loneliness sort of equates to, a considerable amount of smoking, when you talk about the impact that it has on your lifespan and your well-being, So what we're saying is money in itself can be a really useful and great thing, but more often than not, it's a means to an end. And what is that end? The end is our values. And so arguably money's not important at all in terms of our connectedness to each other. We don't need to be wealthy to be able to spend time together, to enjoy each other's company, to be a community. But in Western society, some of the other things that we value do cost money. And so, it's one of those things. And so I think it's great to focus on money. I think it's great to, be able to provide for ourselves as long as it doesn't come at the great expense of the other things that are important, connection to each other, our health and wellness, and, some of those other really important values.
I heard someone once say that most people say family is important to them. And so planning for a family, you find a partner and you plan for a family, that's really great. But if all you ever did was actually just having one child after the other, at some point that's no longer going to be what you're actually trying to achieve when you say you want a family and you're planning for it and having connection,
Yeah. It's about keeping our values in mind and continuing, I think, to review them from time to time. Our values tend not to change greatly over our lifespan, but it is important to be flexible about which values are the most important ones in any situation. So we don't want to be rigid about how we apply values. So family is very important, but there are going to be times when our family does need to take second place or even third place in some situations some of the time. And that's what we mean about being flexible. In fact, the term psychological flexibility is considered to be one of the key hallmarks of good mental health. So we're not rigid in how we apply our values or honour our values in our life, but neither are we chaotic in terms of not having anything and just kind of going from one whim to the next and being really pushed around by our feelings. Our feelings can be useful, but they're not generally a good guide in and of themselves for our behaviour.
So, look, taking you back to that story of the Caribbean, I mean, is there anything from there that you miss in that sort of opulent lifestyle that you were able to experience back then?
No, I'd be happy to go back there because it's a beautiful place, and just to experience it again for a short period of time, I wouldn't want to live there again. In fact, it was actually, despite the paradise nature of it, it was actually quite a hard place to live. And for the reasons you'd expect, and that is the disconnection from family and friends. So we had something of a community there among the staff that lived there, and some of those people were easy to live with and some weren't. It was a small island, and so, you were kind of in each other's lives quite a lot. That was nice, but the people that really make all the difference, the extended family, the friends, a lot of those people we didn't see for an entire year. And so, yeah, I wouldn't have that life again if it meant that I had to sacrifice having those people in my life, which, because it's so remote, it did mean that.
Yeah. And coming back to Australia, was that hard for you to go from one lifestyle to the next, or did you sort of feel like, no, it was time and it was easy transition?
Absolutely. We could have stayed longer. Yeah. But after a year, I had had enough. And so coming back to Australia was a no-brainer.
Yep.
It was an absolute joy and zero regrets.
Yeah.
And that was despite the fact that we were making very good money over there.
Yeah.
We could have obviously been a lot wealthier if we had stayed. But again, when you sort of like consider your values as you're making a decision, it's like, look, the money's great, but it's coming at too high a cost to the things that matter more.
So, look, getting onto that, in regards to you being a psychotherapist and that's your profession, how has that affected and how has that helped you in regards to your finances, your future planning, your direction?
It actually has been really helpful, again, because I'm not just a psychotherapist. I consider myself a full-on psychology nerd. I read about psychological matters all the time. Yeah, I love it. I love knowing more. And of course, really psychology research, I mean, there's certainly a lot of it around, but it hasn't been researched for as long as other topics.
Sure.
And so, there is so much more to discover, so much more to learn, so many things that we think are kind of established facts, are still changing as the research gets better. So it's a really exciting area to read in and to know about. And it's affected my life in so many positive ways. But I think one of the ones that's most obvious to me is the ability to manage feelings. It's not something that was taught at school at all when I was there. I think some schools now do have some instruction in it. And I still think that a lot of the information that I see in the literature is not great when it comes to working out what do we do with these experiences called feelings, Because I've done the reading and the research and because I explain it so often to people, I feel like I've got a whole lot more clarity around what's going on in here. And on good days, I can take quite uncomfortable, quite difficult feelings and manage them a lot better than I would have if I didn't have this information. And, to reference something we were talking about earlier, that doesn't always mean I can do it on my own either. We manage feelings better when we're together.
Yeah. I think, Hamish would agree. You've only got to talk to you for a short time about your profession to see, how much joy and how invested you are in that and in the concepts around psychotherapy and psychology and helping people and doing those sorts of things.
I could bang on for hours about it.
Well,
I won't.
It's interesting in the sense that, you go back 50 years and most of us worked with machines.
Yeah.
So now most of us work with people.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, you can pull apart a machine, put it back together again, and typically it will behave in a similar fashion. Whereas, pulling apart a human being and trying to put them back together again is a very different beast, isn't it?
Yeah, it doesn't always go well when you do that. Yeah.
So-
No, that's true. And in fact, I think one of the things that reminds me of, Hamish, is that the OECD has done some research on the key skills, if you like, for 2025, and found that the skills that are going to be most in demand in jobs worldwide in 2025 are mostly those so-called soft skills that were kind of devalued in the machine age. They were considered superfluous and a waste of time. But I think 8 out of 10, I think it may have been, of the top skills that employers will be looking for are all around being able to manage ourselves and manage our relationships with other people.
So how do you do that with your own family? How do you teach them to manage their relationships? How do you teach them to, be able to go on to a career that in a world where soft skills are really important?
Yeah.
And if I can add to that, sorry, and especially when, one of my catchphrases to people whenever they've married a psychologist is, that's got to be tricky at times.
Yes, I think my husband would completely agree with you, Hamish.
Has your husband ever found himself, washing up dishes or mowing the lawn and thinks to himself, how did I get here? Why am I doing this?
I've just been managed.
Yeah. Well, I haven't asked him that question. The answer is probably. I also have a 17-year-old daughter, and I don't pretend to be able to tell her much at all about what to do, I joke with my clients all the time. I said earlier that there's not much that we can control. Yeah. Definitely not other people, right?
Yeah.
Even our kids.
Yeah.
Like, we can have influence on a good day, right?
Yes.
That's not control.
No.
Right? So, I try to have these talks with my daughter, and I think sometimes she might actually be listening. Hard to tell, really.
Other times she just probably goes, Mum's just doing her work thing on me.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think so, yeah. I think probably a better answer is to try to model that stuff myself.
Yeah.
So, I'd like to think that I'm better at that than I used to be. I think I'm a work in progress, however, and don't pretend to sort of, be anything close to a perfect parent.
Aren't we all?
Yeah. We all just do our best, don't we? But, I try to be that person that I would like her to be.
I think it almost comes back to what we talked about before, those myths around different professions. Hamish is a financial advisor, so therefore his finances must be just going through the roof and perfect. You're a psychotherapist, and so therefore your family should be perfect. And that you should be perfect, and and things around that. Yeah. It's a bit like I remember talking to someone whose father was a principal. And they were saying it was just so hard because even the teachers would assume that I was going to be the perfect child at school. I was going to be the most studious. I was going to be the one that did the most amount of work. Got no detentions, never got in trouble. And I think almost to a degree that it sort of created a little bit of rebellion there to not want to be that.
Yeah, absolutely. We refuse to be put in a box.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh, and look, I still remember playing tennis a lot as a kid, and my coach sort of said, this concept of coaching, and I just made an assumption that a tennis coach must have been better than the number one player. And he was going, no. Most of the time it's the tennis coach that didn't actually cut it as a player.
That's right.
But they've then gone to develop other skills, right, that have helped other players become great. So, it is that, understanding that even though you learn something and there's a practice behind it, as you said earlier, it's that human behaviour still gets in the way. We're still all fallible creatures that are going to make mistakes.
Well, I actually had a staff member once complain that they were better at me than they were better at the job. And I sat back and I smiled at them and said, yeah, you are. That's why I employ you.
Yeah.
If you weren't better than me, I wouldn't employ you. I'd just do it myself. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that I'm not here to actually train, direct, help, guide, point out where you could be doing better. And I think that coaching thing is actually so important because you're right. The number one tennis player doesn't look for a better person to be their coach. There is no one better. And the number 2 player is not going to coach them.
Quite often, they probably don't have very good skills as interpersonal skills. They're probably just so focused on what it means to be a great tennis player that's all they do. So anyway,
Yeah. So, for you, if we reflect back on your life, reflect back on, all the things that you've done and where you've been, I mean, is there specific lessons that you've gone, that really helped me to push ahead, quite dramatically? We've talked about the idea of understanding the difference between happiness and contentment, not being fearful in regards to taking experiences or taking opportunities. Are there any other areas that you've sort of thought, wow, that has actually been quite effective for me?
One of them that occurs to me now is the importance of not avoiding stuff.
Yeah.
So there are always going to be things in life that when we think about them or we do them or we come into contact with them are going to make us feel uncomfortable or downright distressed. And so, I guess I'm talking here about, feelings can be very uncomfortable and we don't want to have those feelings. There are things we don't want to think about, so we try to avoid the feelings. There are people that we don't want to see, so we try to avoid them. There are situations we've been in that, we want to avoid again. And look, avoidance is at times it is useful, particularly as a short-term safety strategy. So, for example, if I've just been through, some kind of major trauma, it's probably going to be good for me to just take things a little bit easy and to make my life a bit small for a while.
Be a bit kind to yourself.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. As a long-term strategy, avoidance is really not good. We all tend to avoid stuff. And so I think that a really key life skill that I've observed for me has been to be, again, it comes back to that fear stuff really. It's recognising that actually I do have what it takes to be able to deal with the things that perhaps I don't want to look at or I don't want to experience. So, if you think about avoidance behaviours, that can be anything from, drug or alcohol addictions, so that they're not facing certain feelings like, a sense of failure or distress. Avoidance can be overthinking things, trying to seek a lot of reassurance to avoid that feeling of, anxiety and what if. Avoidance.
Have I done the right thing?
Yeah, that's right. Avoidance can be not being prepared to go to certain places, see certain people, activities like driving a car. Avoidance comes in so many different flavours. And I think one of the best things that people can do is to, with the help of someone else if need be, but to actually ask themselves those hard questions. What are the things that perhaps I'm afraid of, that I avoid? It's a tough question to ask, but it's a really courageous one.
Yeah.
And look, arguably, I might have a morbid fear of snakes. And, because I don't come across many snakes in my life, it's not going to be an important one to sort of, to overcome unless I really want to. But some of the things that people fear, for example, I work a lot in the relationship space, and some people are very afraid of intimacy, being close to people, showing affection, receiving affection, feeling safe and stable. There is a sizable proportion of people, probably more than half the population, that have difficulties with that, either because they're anxious that if people knew the real them, they would abandon them and go, and so they're quite anxious, or that, being in a relationship means that other person is going to hurt me and things are going to end badly. And so, when you start avoiding everyday things like relationships, you just know life is not going to be good.
Yeah. I mean, look, I had a colleague that I work with when it comes to avoidance, that they would use the idea of saying yes. And I think they actually genuinely meant it. So you'd ask them to do something, or you'd talk about an area that needed to change, whatever else, and they'd go, yes, I'll totally do that. I'm on board. And they'd look you in the eye and you would think they're on board and they would do that. And then you realise a month later, nothing's changed.
Yeah.
And they're actually not on board and they didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
But the avoidance that they have actually developed was to be positive in the face of that and then actually just not change and not do anything.
And they potentially also avoid the discomfort of actually being honest and saying, no, I'm sorry, Steve, I can't do that.
100%. Yeah,
that's right. Avoidance comes in so many flavours, and we can honestly get a significant way through our life and not realise that we're avoiding things. And sometimes, as I said, significant things. And so I think one of the best things people can do, and I'm certainly on that path myself, is looking carefully at the things that we avoid and asking ourselves, I wonder if there's another way forward. I wonder if I can find myself safe enough to realise I don't need to avoid that anymore. Yep. I can deal with it.
Yeah.
That's an important one for me.
It's interesting when you think about fear, because I guess I've quite often reflected on the fact that fear it's almost an easy word to use, but then there's other words behind the fear, like embarrassment or pride or a lack of acceptance or confidence or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
Is that something that, in your role that you typically try and dig into those things as well? Yeah.
It absolutely is, Hamish. So the research is really clear that when it comes to managing feelings, while you might think of your feeling as you might describe it as fear, okay, which is, look, it's a decent starting point. But actually, the more granular, the more specific you get with being able to name your feelings, generally speaking, the better you manage them. And so you're right. You start with fear, but then you might break it down and say, well, it's a bit of this, it's a bit of that, it's a bit of something else. And I think there's a couple of reasons why that's effective. Number one, I think, when you experience fear, it's really happening in the fear centres of the head, which are not they're not open to a lot of reason. All right, they're very primitive, they're very reactive, they're impulsive. When we have to start to name our feelings more specifically, now we're engaging the thinking part of our brain, and so when you do that, now you're not gripped by those fears anymore. We're not taken captive by them. Now we can start to, think things through, get some solutions happening. But I think also the granularity that I was talking about, that you referenced, is also about recognising that feelings, including fear or whatever other descriptive terms you use, are potentially signals. They're temporary signals, but they're signals. They're coming from the body and potentially they're carrying a message. And so fear can help you to kind of go, what is it that I'm afraid of? But if you have a more specific term, you're probably more likely to work out what it is that needs your attention. If anything needs your attention, sometimes the answer is nothing needs your attention. Sometimes the answer is that feeling's coming up. It's an old feeling. I know why it's there. I'm just going to let it be there and I'm going to get on with life. Sometimes that is the best way forward. But if this is a new feeling and you want, rather than going, it's not quite fear, I think it's embarrassment, now you can start to ask yourself a better question. What is it that's embarrassing me? Is this something that needs my attention? Is this a problem that I can solve? Do I need to? Is it worthwhile?
But I think it is important to recognise that sometimes we're not going to know what we're fearful of, that it does take time to process it at times until you have that penny drop moment where you go, oh, that's why I'm feeling that way.
And sometimes you actually never learn. Sometimes you never find out. It's not a precise science, sometimes we work it out and sometimes we don't. And so, in those times when, that signal comes up from the body, we experience it as fear or more specifically as embarrassment. Sometimes over time we do make that connection and we can do something about it. Sometimes we don't. And when we don't, I think it's really a case of going back to our values once again, because, they are the guide for our behaviours. And it's like, okay, I'm feeling embarrassed. I've got no idea why, now what? Who do I want to be in this moment? How do I show up and how do I move forward? And, you know, as I said, generally speaking, our feelings are not good guides to, you know, ongoing behaviour. They might signal a specific issue that needs our attention, but if we were to let that embarrassment actually kind of run us, you know, we may find ourselves avoiding people and situations because embarrassment's quite uncomfortable. If I live with my values and one of my values is connection, I might go, okay, I'm feeling uncomfortable. I've got no idea what it is, but you know what? I want to connect with this person because that's what I value. I want to help this person to feel at ease. I want to feel at ease. So I'm going to talk to this person because even though I know I can feel some discomfort here, you know what? Not going to kill me. I can move forward and it's okay. And I know that even though I'm acutely aware of my embarrassment, there's a really good chance they're not.
Fantastic. Yeah. So look, Toni, I've got a question for you that I like to ask all of our guests.
Oh.
If you're going to start a book tomorrow, what would you write on? What would it be?
Thank you for asking that question, Steve. I started a book some weeks ago. I'm in the process of writing a book.
So hang on, let me ask it again. Toni, if you started a book 3 weeks ago,
yep,
what would you be writing on?
I would be writing on how to overcome childhood adversity so that you can show up in relationships in a way that is consistent with your values.
That's a long title.
Yeah, it is a long title. It's not the title. Yes, I am. The title, the working title so far is Love with Confidence.
Love with Confidence. I like it.
Love with Confidence. Yep, that's right, because that's what people want. They want to be able to love, and ideally with some kind of confidence about it. And so the good news in my book, and it is a good news book, is that so many of us grew up with either trauma or more subtly and subtle in that people don't recognise it, childhoods that weren't ideal in terms of our emotional needs being either just abused or neglected. I've spoken to many people that struggle in relationships, and eventually the penny drops in terms of their connection with their own childhood. Now, it's not to blame our parents because a lot of this stuff is intergenerational, but it is to help us to understand that it's not burned into our psyche. We weren't born with it. It's not genetic. We're not broken. We're not faulty. We're not. It's not a part of us
that can't be changed or moved or adjusted to. Or
precisely. And so when we understand that there is a childhood connection, that the beliefs that run our lives were learned as kids, and therefore we can unlearn them. I like to say they were borrowed from our parents and key adults in our life, and there comes a time where you actually want to give back the ones that don't work. Not literally, but it's recognising that we didn't get to define ourselves as children necessarily. That was done for us, but as adults we can do that. And so we can change our beliefs about ourselves and then learn the key skills like being able to regulate our emotions, like being able to ask for what we want and have good, clear personal boundaries, like being able to let go of past trauma and distress, those things that can sometimes come up and interfere in our life.
And I think it's interesting when you said that is that, you know, for so many people, they would hear that and they would be like, no, my childhood was great. My parents are amazing.
Yeah, I hear it all the time.
Yeah, and it's that almost you feel like you're betraying someone if you, you know, admit that there was maybe something that could be different. And what was really helpful to me was when someone actually said, I want you to remove the concept of love and loyalty and, you know, all those things out of that situation, because even you as a parent, you know that you've made mistakes.
Sure.
You know that in some way I will have done something that will, you know, handicap my children to be whatever, you know, and they've got to learn through that. So it's not actually about saying my parents did a bad job, you know, or that I had a bad childhood or that, you know, whatever the reason is. It's actually about going, this was the childhood that I had, however good or bad it is. How do I move forward from there? How do I learn from that experience? But I think for a lot of people, the key part is actually stopping to say, if I actually admit that I need to change something, then I'm sort of saying that my childhood, my parents, my upbringing was wrong or bad or incorrect or whatever else.
Yeah, I think that you've captured quite well the attitudes of many people that, present for therapy. Not everybody, everyone's slightly different. But yeah, we don't make that connection to our childhoods for a number of reasons, out of loyalty to our parents, out of not wanting to seem that we are blaming them. But for many of my clients, I find that their definition of what a good childhood is, in many ways their childhood was good, absolutely.
Yeah.
But if you get down to details, down to specifics, we can be provided for in many important ways and yet find that our emotional needs weren't necessarily cared for as well as they could have been. And so my book is definitely not about blame the parents. It's the opposite, really. It's helping people to see that, look, absolutely, their upbringing was a factor, okay, in what's going on. But only to understand that because now, as adults, they have choice. They didn't have choice when they were young. So, people find themselves doing what they would consider terrible things in relationships and feel like they're a very bad person. What we're saying is, look, childhood factors certainly had a role in this. But you know what? You're an adult now. You get to choose who you are. You get to choose how you show up in relationships. You get to choose the actions that you take. Now, I know I'm making that sound deceptively simple. Of course, it's not that easy, but I think for many people, it's a little bit easier than they think it is. And so I really encourage people to take the steps to really put their past in the past.
Yeah, that's a great line, that.
Thanks, Steve. I'm glad you liked it.
Look, I mean, if you take an emotional, the emotions out of it, I mean, a good example is bias. And I know we've discussed this before, Hamish, that people come, into the financial sector with different biases that they've picked up either from their parents, their childhood, their school life, whatever they've learned. It's not about going, it was bad or wrong or it was terrible, but actually recognising where your bias come from, recognising, for instance, your parents might say property is the only way to wealth.
Yeah.
That isn't a bad thing, but it's important to recognise that that's what you see as being, really the most effective way forward, because you're not going to look at managed funds or any other thing if that's all you think about. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a less emotional thing, but it's still really important to actually go, okay, this is what my belief is, this is where it's come from. Now, how do I mould, change, adjust that to be something else, to be more beneficial to me?
Yeah, we are all biased,
Well, it's not just, it is bias, and I'm just playing around with this, and it's almost conditioning as well.
Sure.
We're conditioned to watch movies, right, and then think that this is what family life looks like. It's Steve Martin and 12 kids and all having fun, or whatever it happens to be. And of course, because those movies are the ones that sell, they're the stories that make us laugh or cry or whatever.
Or if you want to really go to the 60s, the perfect Brady Bunch. Yeah. I actually don't know of a blended family that has such a good, family unit, cohesion with two parents that love each other and 6 kids that all get along and
a maid.
And a maid that with her butcher boyfriend, you're right, it is that conditioning to, if we don't have that, we assume that's normal.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of that growing up, isn't it? It's realising that this conditioning, even education, you think if you go to school and then we reflect on how many of the subjects do we actually use in real life, and we go, okay, I know there was a purpose why they taught me all this stuff, but it's still lost on me 30 years later.
Yeah, I agree. Anything mathematical, I kind of go, lost on me. I'm glad you guys know maths. Not my thing.
If you don't mind, that's actually an interesting segue, because, one of the questions that I've reflected on, especially with you, because you are a different personality to especially me, and maybe Steve as well, is going on this journey of doing these modules for Help My Wealth. Have there been any, moments or key, penny drop moments where you've sort of gone, okay, this is actually possibly more important than I gave it credit for originally?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Look, whenever I get the opportunity to bring my knowledge together, I mean, like doing this interview, for example, but certainly with the Help My Wealth project, when you get the opportunity to bring all the information together in a way that's that needs to be clear for other people, that whole process always gives me, new ways of looking at things. I always learn something. It's like writing the book. It's happening there as well. I think one of the key things that came out of Help My Wealth when I collaborated there was the importance of early beliefs. And this is something that, as I said before, is coming up as very key in my book. If I reflect on my own upbringing, there wasn't a lot of money. It wasn't ever really talked about. And so I sort of got to adulthood completely clueless about it, And again, I wouldn't, my parents weren't saying, look, money's evil and you shouldn't think about money. It just wasn't a topic. It just wasn't on their radar, and therefore it wasn't on my radar, So I guess, I got the message because it wasn't talked about that it's just not a thing. Do you know what I mean? And so I had the opportunity to reflect on my early experience and see how formative that was. And again, unless we deliberately do that, we don't often make those connections. And I actually think those connections are, quite important. Yeah, I like making them. We don't always have the luxury to see the connection of where we are now to our childhood. Sometimes it remains forever unknown. But when we can, I find those aha moments particularly useful, and I know my clients do as well. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, look, I know for me, especially when I've been doing sales training and mentoring in the business world, I often talk about the idea that someone's skill you can teach someone, you can increase their skill level, it can be taught.
Yeah.
But I find what's actually almost more important is the attitude and what happens. And I've often used this example of saying, your boss calls you up and says, Hamish, done an amazing job, like blown away. I was talking to the assistant manager. They've been saying how good you are and how well you've done. You're getting a bonus, this month. It's going to be, I don't know, $500, and you're getting the Employee of the Month award. What's Hamish like that day? He is on the ball. He's selling left, right and centre. He's calling up contacts. He's happy as everything. He's giving nudges to people going, got a call from the boss, Can't say what it was, but, it's good. Next day, same guy calls you up, boss calls you up and he says, Hamish, I'm really sorry. It's a bit embarrassing, but it wasn't you, Hamish. It's the other Hamish. It is odd we've got two Hamishes in the office, but we do in this scenario. And that Hamish, he's the one that's been doing really well. So I'm sorry, but he's actually getting the bonus. Now, funny story, because you did come up, I actually did speak to the other manager about you, and he's been saying they've had some problems with you recently, and we do need to have a sit down and have a talk.
Yeah.
So I've actually scheduled that for tomorrow. So you, me and, Sarah, we're going to sit down, we're going to talk about where you're at and what your direction is in the company. What's Hamish's day like? Yeah, it is a terrible day. He's embarrassed, it's hard, but his skill hasn't changed. His skill level and who he is did not change from one day to the other. It was his attitude. It was what was happening around him. It was his concepts around happiness and contentment. It was all of those stuff. And so when we brought the behavioural psychology modules in to Help My Wealth, for me, that was the whole concept, is that we can show people how to do cash flow. We can show people how to do budgeting. We can talk about investments. We can set people up with goals, and we can set people up to really know where they're heading. But without that behavioural psychology coming in and helping people to get their private world ordered, I think it's actually a large part missing. So it was really great to have you come in, take that project on. And also it was really good because you really got into it. You really loved it and it became your project, and, you drove it much further than when Hamish and I were even talking about doing, which was fantastic. Do you know what I mean? And it went places that we love to see. And I actually found I got quite educated through it as well. So I really appreciate you doing that.
Oh, thanks. Look, yeah, it was really enjoyable. And I think that, we all agree that decisions about finance reflect decisions in general. You know, decisions are part of, you know, the way we think, what we feel, our conditioning, as we said earlier. You know, these are decisions, they're actions. And so if you think about it at that very basic level, you really can't divorce good financial decisions from the human that's making them.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so it's one thing to have the information and the knowledge, but without, you know, I guess looking at the being that is taking this information and making decisions and taking action on it. If you don't consider that side of things, you haven't really got a complete service. You know, and so I think that it is critically important that people understand, you know, how they bring their experience, their thinking style, their typical behaviours, their preferences, their motivation, their attitudes. It sounds like an awful lot, but the modules themselves, I think, break that down fairly simply. And while there's more and more and more that could be included, because
you just keep
it's
adding
very
to
complex.
It,
Yeah. But I think a lot of the basic things are there as a great starting point to help people to, you know, to realise that they're a person. They're not a computer that crunches numbers. And it's important to understand who this is.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming today, and we've really appreciated you know, coming on the Money Rules podcast and helping to expand upon what you did for us, you know, with the Help My Wealth modules. But very much appreciate your time, and it was great having you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. Love chatting.
Great. Well, for all the listeners that are out there, thank you again for being a part of this podcast, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.
Bye.
The information discussed by the Help My Wealth and the Money Rules podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only and is general in nature, and it is not advice. It is not intended as a substitute for professional finance, legal or tax advice. It is aimed to provide a general understanding of each topic and should not be relied upon to make an investment or financial decision. It is strongly suggested that you seek professional advice regarding your own individual circumstances before making a financial decision. Help My Wealth and the hosts of the Money Rules podcast are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. Do not take financial advice from a podcast. In the spirit of reconciliation, Help My Wealth and the Money Rules podcasts acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and the connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to past, present and emerging elders. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today.